I don't know what's my problem. I just love a weird story. I always have. Urban legends, cryptids, unexplained events, people that go missing under strange circumstances, you name it. That's why it started. There are a number of those in the city where I live, but for some reason, it's not that easy to find detailed information about them. I loved those stories I grew up with and decided someone had to do it. I started investigating some of them and documenting what I found. I looked up old newspapers, I interviewed people who could shed any light on them, I searched the places where they supposedly happened. Maybe I'll start a blog, maybe I'll write a book, or maybe I'll make a documentary, who knows? However, that's for another time. What I'm about to tell you is not one of those. It happened a few months ago. I was after what probably is the most popular urban legend we have here. After all, I had to start somewhere. The most well-known version of the tale tells of a woman who, around 60 years ago, would seduce men and invite them to her home. Take them to the cemetery and say that's where she lived. Other versions claim she would kill those men, or that it was just a rumor started by a radio talk show as a prank. I spoke to some people who worked at the cemetery or lived nearby and eventually found out about an old lady who had lived in a house close to the cemetery for almost 70 years. I called her and told her about my project. She said she would love to help however way she could, and invited me over. I got there the next day, and she was kind old woman that looked like a perfect grandma, with pure white hair and a very lively mood. She offered me coffee and some snacks. We talked for a couple hours. There was no groundbreaking testimony, since she was only a small child when it had happened. But she did relay what information she had learned throughout her life. Most rumors that circulated and stories her mother would tell her as a child. Apparently, it was common for parents in that neighborhood to use that story to scare children, so they would keep away from the cemetery and not cause any trouble. At some point during our conversation, her granddaughter walked into the room and joined us. She must have been around 8 years old, and she was the cutest little thing. Mostly she just listened, but every once in a while she would offer her insight on the topic. Though she was quite shy, the old lady apologized for the kids' meddlesomeness, said she loved those stories. I wasn't bothered in the least, however. I love children, and I came here for the exact same reason. It seemed like the kid heard the story 1,000 times before and intently listened to everything her grandmother said, regardless. The old lady told me everything she could and answered my questions. She showed me the second floor of her home. From there, you could see over the walls of the cemetery. In the end, I didn't learn a lot, though most of what she said backed up the information I already had. I was about to leave when the kid finally overcame her shyness and asked who I was, so I introduced myself and told her about my project. And her eyes lit up. She said she knew tons of stories and would love to help. And that was the first time I ever heard of the grave robber, according to her. There have been many rumors of a man who would break into cemeteries around the city and dig up bones. Some say he was obsessed with death. Some say he would use them in dark magic rituals, but nobody knows for sure, and despite saying it was a man, no one had actually seen what he had looked like. The few witnesses to his work only described a tall, thin figure in a dark cloak, always hunched over and moving swiftly through the night. But watch out, those who speak of him might fall victim to his curses. That's the gist of it. As far as urban legends go, it was pretty ordinary, but that kid, she was the best storyteller I'd ever seen. It was like she became an entirely different person when telling the story. She acted it out with perfection. She would observe my reactions and change her tone to provoke me more. She used words 8-year-olds shouldn't know existed. She wanted to scare me, and she knew exactly how to do it. And I was scared. I was about to rip a set of holes in the sofa with my nails. I felt like every single strand of hair on my body was standing on its end, and can't even imagine what kind of expression I had on my face. Never in my life had I been struck so hard by a story like this, let alone one told by a child. I asked whether it was real or not. All my stories are real, the kid replied. I found that to be suspicious, but the old lady confirmed it. Said it had been on the local news for some time ago. I guess I must have missed it. It was started to get dark, so I had to leave. The kid had switched back to her regular shy self, but her grandma was friendly as ever and told me I could come back whenever I needed anything else for my project. I left her home, and while standing on the bus stop close to the cemetery gates, I started to think about the grave robber. Was that story actually real? Or, more accurately, were the rumors real, or did she make it all up? How could I have completely missed something like that? Even if I haven't been keeping up with the news, I have a number of friends who know of my interests and would have told me about it. Or did those two do it on purpose? Were that kid and her grandmother trying to fool me? Could the story be real? Could the grave robber be real? When I got home, the first thing I did, of course, was look it up. I asked a couple of people I know and read the newspapers from the past week, searched the internet, but found nothing. Not one mention of graves being dug up during the night, let alone dark figures roaming cemeteries. Thinking about it, when exactly was some time ago, I had just assumed it was recently, but I might be wrong. Was it a couple months ago? Maybe a couple years ago? Or was it an old story like the one I had been researching? A story that never became popular enough, but the people who lived around the cemetery knew well and told their children. I doubt this thing really exists, but decided to investigate it anyway. There are 2 reasons for that. First, if there is a story about my city I never heard about, I want to know of its details. Second, I refuse to believe those 2 got the better of me and want to make sure. So I took off again the next day, back again to the cemetery. The old lady wouldn't pick up her phone, leaving me with a little choice, so I started to ask around. I spent the whole morning roaming the place, asking anyone I could come across if they had ever heard of the case. People who worked there were more helpful, but visitors mostly gave me just weird looks. But no one knew what I was talking about. I spent the following day at the local library looking for old papers or anything that could have any mention of a grave robber in our local cemeteries. But again, I found nothing. During the night, I had some trouble sleeping. I had a weird dream about a grave robber. I can't remember much of it, though, only that I saw a dark figure walking through a cemetery. On the 3rd day, I finally got a hold of the old lady. When I asked her about the grave robber, she laughed. Great story, wasn't it? But yes, it's true. It was on the news a couple of years ago. She refused to elaborate further and changed the subject entirely. I spent another half hour on the phone with her, giving nothing more than monosyllabic answers. God, I hate people who talk too much. Then another afternoon at the library, still nothing. No clues, no leads, nothing. The next morning, something happened. I saw in the news that a grave in the cemetery had been dug up and all the bones were stolen. I was ecstatic. I went looking for any article I could find and tried to call the old lady again, and then I woke up. It was a dream, and I still knew nothing about the grave robber. I haven't slept well since that afternoon at the old lady's house, and I had another terrible day. I can't keep this up. My investigations led absolutely nowhere, and college work is getting late. But I can't just give this story up, can I? So I decided to put an end to it that night. The following morning I called the old lady again, said I had some other questions for my project, and asked if I could come over. Being the nice old lady she is, she agreed. I got there the afternoon, but the kid wasn't there. The old woman said her grandchild slept over and saw the grave robber last night. Now she was too scared to come near the cemetery. How could this actually happen, she wondered. It was just a silly story, something she saw on the local news decades ago, and her grandkid made a story out of it. Could it really be the grave robber? No, it wasn't. It was a thin, tall figure in a dark cloak, always hunched over, moving swiftly through the night. But not the same one. It was just someone trying to pass for the subject of the tale he once heard. I know, of course, because I was there last night. I was there at the cemetery, dressed in black, digging up a grave. I noticed the kid was staring at me from the window, and I stared back at her. And so the storyteller was scared by her own story, beaten at her own game. And I won.